In the space of 20 years, Florence Nightingale's precepts were adopted in countries of very different cultures. In Germany, her exchanges with deaconesses were fruitful, and her ideas circulated throughout Northern Europe. Strangely, France was one of the only countries unaware of her work. She was hardly known. In the French health system, there were no nurses. It was nuns who were in charge of caregiving. Since the 12th century, Christianity had brought hospitals and churches together, assimilating spiritual help with bodily help. The vocation of Augustinians and Daughters of Charity was to help the poor and the sick.
Posterity remembers Florence Nightingale as the woman who invented the nursing profession, modern nursing. This is slightly, albeit rightly, at the expense of the congregations of nuns who held an extremely important place in the 19th century.
Religious congregations were firmly rooted in the hospital system. They even survived the French Revolution. But from the secular viewpoint, which overtook France, nuns didn't have the necessary training for nursing. They were too busy saving the souls of the sick, not their bodies.
So they arrived from the provinces, were summarily trained in Paris, before being sent out in accordance with contracts, which were signed between the religious congregation and the hospital or municipality, which wanted to employ sisters in their charitable organizations or hospitals. They formed a personnel which was mobile and easily deployable throughout France.
Since its arrival in power in 1870, the French Third Republic had wanted to initiate a large secular program in schools, then in hospitals. In terms of public health, the reform pioneer was a doctor, Désiré Magloire Bourneville. Fiercely anti-clerical, he favored hygiene theories and promoted the recent work of Louis Pasteur on antiseptics. Hospitals needed lay nurses capable of assisting doctors. But expelling all the nuns from public hospitals would require costly training programs.
If they wanted to expel, they needed to replace, which limited the expulsions. Overall, nuns were generally kept in hospitals, often with the support of the hospital administration, for financial reasons. As they had no family to care for, they could be paid less than lay nurses. Even though, despite everything, female salaries in the 19th century were often considered complementary to a male salary. This didn't stop the nuns being relatively badly paid. In fact, nuns in France remained in hospitals up until the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
In 1880, Bourneville finally opened a nursing school at the Salpêtrière Hospital, the first one. Open to valorous daughters of the people, it welcomed dozens of candidates from all over France. Most of the young women who came to the Salpêtrière could neither read nor write. Whereas 20 years earlier, Florence Nightingale had recommended recruiting young women with a good level of education, France opened its school to as many as possible, often without education. This choice was to impact the development of the profession and the relative recognition of the first French nurses. But while Paris was struggling to replace nuns with lay nurses, a female doctor seized upon the Nightingale system to install it in Bordeaux.
Laicization had already been in full swing for several years, with two very distinct positions in the recruitment and training of nurses, a position based in Paris under the auspices of Bourneville, and a position in Bordeaux under those of Anna Hamilton. Anna Hamilton was convinced that nurses needed to be women who were already educated and trained. They should be equal to a doctor, meaning they were capable of making choices and understanding what the doctor was doing, and from the same social background as Florence Nightingale.
A disciple of the English heroine, Anna Hamilton also had a strong personality. Independent, she shook up the institution and advanced the cause of nursing care in France.
At the age of 14, her mother had given her notes on nursing to read and had spoken of this woman and what she had done in Crimea. Anna Hamilton had an immediate admiration for Florence Nightingale, for this heroine. She was to become, as she put it herself, a beacon for her.
Daughter of a French mother and English father, Anna Hamilton had studied medicine. Confronted by the social and sexist prejudices within the medical world, she wrote a thesis which caused a stir, Reflections on Hospital Nurses. She was struck by the extent to which France was out of step with England, which already had its first union movements and nurses' marches to demand workers' rights and a respectable salary.
When she went to London in 1899 to carry out research for her thesis, she attended the first International Council of Nurses Congress, and this was where she realized to what extent the principles of Florence Nightingale had spread in the Commonwealth, in England, and in the United States. She was impressed by the level of consideration for the patient. She understood that what was missing in France was the nurse's role between the doctor and patient. She discovered that in England and vowed to set up the same system in France.
After graduating as a doctor, Anna Hamilton became superintendent of the Protestant hospital in Bordeaux in 1901, and also of its nursing school, which was later to become the Florence Nightingale School.
Anna Hamilton was quite attached to the French term garde malade, as opposed to infirmière, the etymology of which she felt had negative connotations.
Dr. Hamilton began by reconsidering the teaching program at the school which had joined the hospital. She opened it up to young non-Protestant women, enriched courses with the latest scientific discoveries, and decided to separate doctors from the training.
Something which was also very important in the Nightingale system and which she retained was that the nurses were directed by women who had themselves been caregivers. So the system had a hierarchy which was very structured, and it was autonomous in relation to the medical and administrative teams. That was also important, and in France, this wasn't necessarily to everybody's liking.
Avoid aggravating the illness, remove new sources of infection, ensure that hospitals cure patients instead of creating new ones. This should be the important role of a true hospital. As such, it's fair to assume that it will soon provide precious service to medical science and public health.
This training was all-encompassing. One might talk of overall management. It was a question of care which was a global concept. Students needed to carry out more than 400 actions. During the course of their training, they spent time in all of the hospital's departments, surgery, medicine, pharmacy. They had very few rest days because they had 646 days of training over the 2 years required to qualify.
With this new generation of nurses, Anna Hamilton wanted to promote a qualified feminine personnel, an elite. They were known as the infirmière Nightingale. They were highly sought after by many French hospitals, both public and private, and were amongst the first mobilized in 1914, when war broke out. But it wasn't until 1922 that the first state diplomas were awarded. It took decades before nurses were finally recognized as health professionals.
It was a long time coming, and there's still a long way to go. First certificate 1922, first recognition of the nurse's role 1978, on paper at least. And in France today, we are still fighting to defend the place of nurses at a university research level. The combat is still the same. Nurses seek recognition through technical activity. They used to talk of delegated tasks, prescribed tasks. And for most nurses, this recognition needs to come from reaching the level of doctors. I think what's necessary today is to return to the heart of the profession. It's the human element, and this sense needs to be rediscovered. As Florence Nightingale and Anna Hamilton said, it's the place of the sick. Today we would say the patient, but in any case, the person, in all that they are and all that they represent.
In 1992, the Florence Nightingale Bagatelle School became a National Institute for Nursing Care Training. Far from having disappeared over time, the impression left by the pioneers is very apparent. It still determines the identity of the school and the desires of future graduates.
There are A and B antigens,
Yes, there are A and B antigens.
which means there are anti-A and anti-B antibodies in the plasma.
Are you sure?
No.
It seems that Jan doesn't agree. Jan, we're listening.
There are A and B antigens on the red blood cells. In the plasma, there are no antibodies.
Very good. Remember yesterday's course.
The Florence Nightingale School provides quality tuition. Even if I think today you can find quality in establishments other than Florence Nightingale. But in people's minds, and particularly the old school, as you might say, there is really this notion of quality and of best school. Consequently, many people said to me, Carla, go to Bagatelle. It's really the best school. Even today you can sense it when you're out on a course and someone says, where are you from? And you reply, Bagatelle, and they say, ah, I see. And that says it all.
Good morning, Mr. Henry. Let me introduce myself. I'm Celia, and I'm a student nurse. I've come to give you a transfusion. The doctor has prescribed 3 units of blood for you. You've been in a road accident and you've lost a lot of blood. And to replace this lost blood, we're giving you a transfusion.
I always wanted to go into caring. It's a domain which always greatly attracted me. Having proximity with the patient, caring for them in a global sense, in all that makes up their lives and help them feel better, is wonderful.
Perfect. Do we agree? That's great. Perfect.
We are really at the centre, the link between doctor and patient. We're always at the patient's bedside, and we're the link between care assistant, doctor, and the entire team. This profession is fascinating.
One of the most essential conditions for being a good nurse is to have a sense of observation. It's in the omission of small gestures, for want of intelligent observation, that the secret of many deaths can be found, appearing to reduce savant medication to nothing.
Today, it is anchored in our way of working, which is unimaginable without all the concepts. The concepts of reassurance and kindness, for example. This was what Florence Nightingale did during the Crimean War. She was known as the lady with the lamp, because at night she went to reassure the patients. So for us, it's logical to be reassuring, to be kind. It's the basis of our ethical code.
The coronavirus pandemic, which originated in China in December 2019 and then spread across the world, highlighted the role of nurses. Like Florence Nightingale, at the time of her fight against cholera and typhus, nurses around the world found themselves in the front line.
We've had to actually resuscitate and reenact the Nightingale precepts and principles of hygiene, circulating air, social kind of distance. She calculated in Notes on Hospital how to space beds, hand hygiene. She wrote about hand hygiene in Notes on nursing. She didn't invent hygiene. You know, she popularised it through her own kind of writings, and she was so able to craft her kind of prose in a way that would make people feel, and I think this is why she is so relevant today, that there is a kind of answer, there is a solution. We can intervene and we can do something about this. And so it made, you know, her audience feel empowered. And I think that's part of her appeal.
In the house in South Street, Florence no longer received anyone in her policy bureau. In 1907, she was awarded the Order of Merit by King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria. She was the first woman to receive this distinction. Aged 87, she humbly received the medal at home.
Nightingale took on the biggest issues of her day, starting a profession for women and making it a good profession, a worthy profession.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Nightingale's principles found a living echo in a social movement which was being heard in London. Suffragettes were in the streets. Women were determined to have their voices heard.
She supported the women's right to vote and all kinds of measures to improve women's lives, jobs for women, and promotions for women, that they could do well in their professions, that certainly they should be able to enter other professions. She's one of the greatest people, not just of the Victorian age or the 19th century. She's one of the people who have shaped our modern world.
The history of Florence is taught to children in their history lessons. So when it comes to young nurses going through their nurse training, they see that they understand what a trailblazer she was, what a leader she was.
Nearing the end of her life, Nightingale's vision was gradually failing, and she could no longer write. She had written nearly 200 books and reports. She had a profound influence on public health policies and health reforms in army and civilian hospitals. On the 13th of August 1910, Florence Nightingale died at home in London from brucellosis complications. She was 90 years old.
I want nothing special. I should like a simple funeral. I should like soldiers to carry my casket and to be buried at the family domain.
Refusing the intended national funeral at Westminster Abbey, Miss Nightingale preferred to be buried close to her family in the little cemetery of East Wellow.
When I'm no longer even a memory, just a name, I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life.
3,000 kilometers from Constantinople, now Istanbul, the lady with the lamp never really left these banks. And the dead of the Crimean War, these soldiers of the Battle of Balaclava, hastily buried behind the vast Scutari barracks. Today, it is a British military cemetery with hundreds of white tombstones overlooking the Bosphorus.
My dear old comrade of Balaclava, and bring them safe to shore. Florence Nightingale.